I was alone. The first night out on a solo trip was always the hardest. It was one thing to be out here in the daylight, setting up camp, feeling capable and strong. But as soon as the sun dropped below the horizon and the sky turned black, the woods became something else. Every noise felt sharper. Every gust of wind sounded too much like movement. The silence between the noises was worse than the noises themselves. I had picked a spot on the edge of the forest, looking out over a small slope that led down to a pebble beach. During the day, it had seemed like the perfect place, secluded, beautiful, just far enough from the main trails that I wouldn't have to worry about passing hikers stumbling into my campsite. But now, as I lay in my small tent with nothing but thin fabric separating me from the wild, I wasn't so sure. I was wide awake. I had tried everything to fall asleep, lying on my back, my side, pulling my sleeping bag tighter, loosening it, focusing on my breathing, but nothing worked. My mind wouldn't let me rest. I had camped alone before, but no matter how many times I did it, that first night was always the same. It took time for my brain to adjust to the sounds of the woods, and right now it wasn't adjusting. The forest was alive with noise. Leaves rustling, branches creaking, the occasional hoot of an owl. Normal things. But my brain didn't process them as normal. Instead, it wanted to interpret every little thing as danger. I kept imagining things that weren't there. Eyes watching me from the trees, footsteps just beyond the range of my hearing, the outline of a figure standing motionless in the dark. I hated how my mind did this to me. I tried to reason with myself. This was a protected park. The only real threats were black bears, and I had taken every precaution. My food was stored properly, my campsite was clean, and bears generally didn't go looking for trouble unless they had a reason. The more likely culprits for the noise outside were raccoons, porcupines, or deer. But reason didn't mean much when I was lying there in the dark, staring at the ceiling of my tent, my heart hammering in my chest at every snap of a twig. Then I heard something heavier, a real footstep. I stopped breathing. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a squirrel. It was weight on the forest floor. A branch cracked, not far from my tent. Something was moving, and it was big. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I went completely still, straining my ears. The footsteps were slow but deliberate. Something was walking through the trees, and it wasn't trying to be quiet. I wanted to believe it was a deer, but my mind wouldn't let me. Instead, it went straight to the worst possibilities. A person, a stranger, out here in the dark, approaching my tent. Why? There was no reason for anyone to be out here. I had a knife in my pack, but it was buried beneath my clothes. My headlamp was within reach, but I was afraid to turn it on. If I made a sound, if I moved, whoever, or whatever, was out there would know I was awake. The footsteps stopped. I lay there, frozen, my breath shallow and uneven. A long moment of silence passed. Then, suddenly, a loud crash. Something tumbled down the slope right outside my tent, sending loose rocks skittering across the beach. My stomach clenched. I fumbled for my headlamp, my hands shaking. I needed to see. I needed to know. My fingers found the switch, and with a quick breath, I clicked it on and unzipped the tent door just enough to shine the beam outside. I expected the worst. Instead, I saw a massive shape sprawled out on the pebbles. For a split second, my brain couldn't make sense of what I was looking at. Then it hit me. An elk. A huge, clumsy, very much alive elk, blinking in confusion as it struggled to get its footing on the loose rocks. It must have lost its balance coming down the slope and fallen right onto the beach in front of my tent. My entire body sagged with relief. I wanted to laugh, but I was still too wired from the adrenaline dump. The elk finally scrambled back to its feet, shook itself off, and trotted unsteadily back toward the tree line, disappearing into the darkness. I sat there for a long time, listening to the woods, my heart still racing. I wasn't in danger. I wasn't going to die alone in the Canadian backwoods. It was just the first night playing tricks on me again. Eventually, I crawled back into my sleeping bag, turned off my light, and stared up at the tent ceiling. The forest noises were still there, but now they felt a little more normal. I still didn't sleep well, but by the time the sun started creeping through the trees the next morning, I felt stupid for ever being so scared. Just another first night in the woods. The 5 of us, barely adults, were packed into my best friend's old sedan, winding our way through the roads of Tennessee, heading for the Smoky Mountains. We were 17 and 18 years old, a mix of high school seniors and fresh graduates, eager to test ourselves against the wilderness. It was the mid-'80s, before Gatlinburg turned into a tourist trap, and the mountains felt wilder back then, less regulated, more dangerous. We rolled into a gas station on the edge of town, one of those places with a single rusty pump and a flickering fluorescent sign buzzing in the damp evening air. The place smelled of old oil and damp wood. As we stepped out to stretch our legs, a toothless old man leaning against the wall gave us a long, knowing look. His face was lined with deep creases, his hair wild under a stained ball cap. "I wouldn't head up there," he muttered, squinting at us with eyes that had probably seen more than we ever would. "Thar's a storm a-brewin' da." Like the cocky idiots we were, we barely gave it a second thought. One of us, probably me, laughed and said something stupid about having rain parkas. Then we piled back into the car and drove straight for the trailhead, too full of ourselves to listen to a man who had probably lived in these mountains his whole life. The first stretch of the hike was brutal. The map hadn't fully conveyed how steep the trail was. We thought we were in shape, but that first leg felt like climbing a ladder made of roots and rock. My thighs burned within the first mile. The backpacks dug into our shoulders. The sky, already gray when we left, darkened further. 2 hours in, the rain started. At first, it was just a light drizzle, cooling the sweat on our backs. But the temperature was dropping fast, and soon, the light rain turned into freezing rain. Within minutes, our jackets were slick with ice. Water seeped into our gloves, our boots, our sleeves. We pressed on, knowing we had to make it to a campsite before dark. The last thing we wanted was to be setting up tents on the side of a mountain in the dark. By the time we stumbled into a flat clearing, our designated campsite, our hands were nearly useless. My fingers were shaking so badly, I couldn't even untie my boots. My hands were so stiff that I had to cut my bootlaces off with a portable saw just to get my feet out of them. The 5 of us huddled in a tent, sealing it up tight to trap in warmth. The air inside grew thick with our breath, and by morning, frost had formed on the inside walls. Outside, the world had transformed overnight. For inches of snow covered the ground. My boots, which I had stupidly left by the fire hoping they'd dry, were frozen solid, curled up like dead things on the rocks. That morning, we all knew we had made a mistake. We were miles into the mountains, freezing, wet, and underprepared. Every one of us showed signs of hypothermia, shaking, slurred speech, slow thinking. We needed to get out. We had a choice. Turn back the 5 miles we had already hiked or push forward 3 more miles to where the trail supposedly intersected with another road. Going forward seemed like the best option. It was shorter, and we figured the road would be a quicker way back to town. But the mountain had other plans. The trail was buried under snow, but we could still follow it, packed down by previous hikers. We moved slowly, still half frozen, trying to keep our footing. The cold seeped into my bones, and every step felt heavier than the last. The wind had picked up, blowing icy flakes into our faces. Then we hit the river. The bridge was gone. Just gone. The storm had washed it away, leaving behind a swollen, fast-moving river between us and the road. We had 2 options: turn around and hike 7 miles back the way we came, or wade through a freezing, waist-deep river. 7 miles back in wet clothes, with nightfall coming fast, wasn't an option. We had no choice. One by one, we stripped off our boots and pants, shoving them into the straps of our backpacks to keep them dry. Barefoot, in nothing but underwear, we stepped into the river. The moment my foot hit the water, I gasped. It wasn't just cold. It felt like knives stabbing into my skin. The pain shot up my legs, through my spine, into my skull. The current was stronger than it looked, pushing against my knees as I took slow, careful steps forward. The rocks beneath my feet were slick. My toes curled against them, trying to find some kind of grip. The water climbed higher, thighs, then waist, then chest. Each step sent another shock of pain through my body. I felt my muscles tightening, locking up. Then one by one, we all fell in. The current was relentless, knocking our feet out from under us, sending us sprawling into the icy water. I went under for a second, my breath stolen from my lungs, and came up gasping. My whole body was on fire, then numb. We scrambled, clawing at rocks, dragging ourselves to the other side. My hands barely worked. My skin was raw and white, my breath coming in shallow gasps. And then my best friend, the one who owned the car, stood up and realized something was missing. His pants. Gone. With them, his wallet, his $200, and worst of all, the car keys. We lost our minds. 5 barefoot teenagers, half frozen and soaking wet, screaming and scrambling through the snow, trying to spot a pair of pants somewhere along the riverbank. We ran like lunatics, slipping and falling, our bare feet going numb in the snow. The pants were gone. There was no backup key. No way to pay for a hotel. No way to call for help. We were screwed. With no other choice, we started walking. 7 miles. Soaking wet. Barefoot. My toes burned, then went completely numb. I didn't know if they were bleeding, and I didn't care. The wind cut through me like a blade. Every step was torture. By the time we hit a road, we must have looked like hell. A local truck driver pulled over, took one look at us, and drove us into town. At the hotel, the lady at the front desk took pity on us. She let us stay in a room with just the promise that our parents would wire money for a new set of keys. She even gave us some food, though I barely remember eating. That night, as I lay in a real bed, my body still aching, I thought about the sounds we had heard in the freezing rain, loud cracks, crashes in the dark. We had thought the wind was taking down branches. But in the morning, looking at the trees, we realized the truth. The rain had frozen onto the trees, and as the wind bent them, the ice cracked and fell like shrapnel. If we had camped in the wrong spot, one of those massive ice-covered limbs could have come down right on top of us. How none of us died, I'll never know. Maybe dumb luck. Maybe something else. But I do know one thing. The next time an old man warns me about a storm in the mountains, I'll listen. 12 days in the Bob Marshall Wilderness. Over 100 miles on foot, carrying everything on our backs, miles away from any road, any town, any real sign of civilization. It was the kind of trip you don't fully grasp until you're in it, deep in the silence of the forest, feeling the weight of every mile in your legs, feeling how small you really are out there. We started off strong, packs heavy but manageable, excited for the challenge. The trail stretched ahead, winding through thick pine forests and open valleys, cutting through rocky terrain and narrow ridgelines. The air smelled like pine needles and dirt, clean and untouched. We were moving well, covering ground at a good pace, finding our rhythm. On the second day, we saw them. A mother grizzly with her cubs, maybe 40 yards away. Too close. Way too close. She was massive, her fur thick and brown, her head turning slowly as she watched us. The cubs stuck close to her legs, barely more than shadows against the trees. We didn't move. We barely breathed. She sniffed the air, ears twitching, muscles tense under her fur. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, every nerve in my body screaming. You hear stories about grizzlies. You see videos, you read advice. Don't run, don't turn your back, don't make sudden movements. But none of that prepares you for actually seeing one in the wild. Nothing but open space and a few trees between you and her. After what felt like forever, she turned, nudged her cubs, and they disappeared into the brush. We stood there for a long time, the weight of what just happened sinking in. If she had decided we were a threat, there was nothing we could have done. No phone to call for help. No road to flag down a car. Just miles of wilderness. We made it to camp just before dark. The night settled in fast, the temperature dropping, the sky full of stars. Everything was still. No distant hum of a highway. No faint glow of city lights. Just darkness and the sound of wind through the trees. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up, crashing in the water nearby. My brain went straight to the worst-case scenario. Bear. Lying in my sleeping bag, I strained to hear, heart pounding in my ears. More crashing, heavy footsteps in the shallow water. It sounded big. I pictured that mother grizzly from earlier, imagined her massive shape moving through the darkness, sniffing at our camp, at our food, at us. My fingers tightened around the bear spray in my sleeping bag. I didn't know what I would do if it really was a bear. The sound moved closer, then away. The water splashed, something heavy moving through it. Then it was gone. The next morning, we found moose tracks along the riverbank. Not a bear, but still massive, still unpredictable. 1,000 pounds of muscle and bone, able to charge in an instant. Out there, everything felt dangerous. As the days passed, we fell into a routine. Wake up, break camp, hike. The wilderness stretched in every direction, untouched and wild. Sometimes we saw signs of other people. A faded boot print in the dirt, an old fire ring at a campsite. But for the most part, it was just us. Days without seeing another soul. We filtered water from streams, cooked simple meals over a tiny stove, packed out everything we brought in. Every night, we hung our food in trees, hoping it would be enough to keep the bears away. By day 11, we were back at that same campsite from earlier, the last stop before finishing the trip. It should have felt like a victory. Almost done. Almost back to warm showers and real food, and sleeping in a bed. But then we saw the tracks. Grisly tracks, fresh, pressed into the dirt right on top of our old boot prints. Not from days ago. Hours, maybe. The size of them made my stomach drop. Deep, wide imprints in the mud, claws visible in some of them. The bear had walked the same trail we had, following our path, passing right through the camp where we were about to sleep. We were exhausted, but none of us slept much that night. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves had me holding my breath, straining to hear more. The wind made the trees groan, shifting their weight, and every time it sounded like footsteps. I lay there, bear spray next to me, gripping the fabric of my sleeping bag, heart racing. At some point, exhaustion won. I must have slept a little, because suddenly it was morning. Cold, damp, gray light filtering through the trees. We packed up quickly, barely speaking, moving on autopilot. No one wanted to linger. The last miles felt longer than they should have, every step heavy, but eventually the trees thinned and the trail let us out. Walking back to the car felt surreal. Civilization didn't feel real anymore. It felt like we had spent a lifetime out there, moving through some ancient place where we didn't belong. The weight of it all settled in. How close we had been to something going wrong, how small we were out there, how easy it would have been to never make it out. That trip stuck with me. Not just the exhaustion or the hunger or the sore muscles. The fear. That deep, primal fear of knowing something bigger, stronger, and more powerful is out there close watching. That fear of being so far from help that no one would even know if something happened to you. That realization that, in the wild, you're just another animal, no more important than anything else. Zaleski State Forest is deep, quiet, and old. Southern Ohio has a way of feeling forgotten, like time doesn't work the same way there. Endless trees, thick undergrowth, ridges and hollows that stretch for miles. It's not the kind of place you end up in by accident. You have to want to be there. It was about 10 years ago when I hiked and camped there with my dad, uncle, and cousins. We weren't new to hiking, but this place was different. Back then, Google Maps barely showed anything for the area. No cell service, no easy way to check a GPS. We had to rely on a paper map to find the trailhead. It was easy to get turned around, and even easier to feel isolated. The plan was simple: hike in, camp for a few nights, then hike back out. We all had our own one-person tents, spaced about 20 to 30 feet apart. Just enough distance for privacy, but close enough to still feel like we were camping together. That first night, we set up camp near an area we'd heard rumors about, an abandoned tunnel, supposedly haunted. None of us really believed in that stuff, but we all knew about the stories. The forest settled into its usual rhythm as the sun went down. The woods in Zaleski have a strange way of swallowing sound. At first, everything seems loud: crickets, frogs, distant rustling. But after a while, you notice how quiet it actually is. No distant highway noise. No hum of planes overhead. Just silence, stretching on forever. I laid in my tent, staring up at the fabric above me, listening. Every now and then, I'd hear movement outside, something small, probably a raccoon or an opossum nosing through the leaves. The wind shifted through the trees, making the branches creak. Normal forest sounds. Nothing out of place. Then, around 3 a.m., it happened. A sound so loud it tore through the silence like a bomb going off. It was massive, deep, metallic. Not a tree falling, not even close. A tree makes a long, drawn-out cracking and snapping before it finally collapses. This was instant. One single, enormous impact. I shot up, heart hammering in my chest. My first thought was a car crash, but that didn't make any sense. We were miles from any road. There was no way a vehicle could be out here. The forest went dead silent. No insects. No wind. No movement. Just absolute stillness. I sat there, frozen, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't a rockfall. It sounded like metal hitting metal, something impossibly large, something that shouldn't be out here. Minutes passed. Nothing. Eventually, I laid back down, but sleep didn't come. My mind kept circling back to the sound. There was no explanation. The next morning, we all looked at each other, knowing none of us had slept much. We didn't talk about it. What was there to say? We had all heard it. We had all felt that moment of sheer, animal fear. But there was nothing to do except pack up and keep moving. For the rest of the trip, the feeling never quite left. That sense of being watched, of something just out of sight. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just the isolation, the exhaustion, the tricks your mind plays when you're deep in the woods. But I've camped a lot of places. I've spent nights alone on the Appalachian Trail, hiked in remote areas where I didn't see another person for days. And I've never heard anything like that night in Zaleski. Hiking in Nepal was supposed to be an adventure. A challenge, sure. Physically demanding, of course. But I thought the biggest struggles would be things like sore feet, long days, and the cold at high altitude. I was wrong. The trek ended up being something else entirely. 36 days of exhaustion, sickness, fear, and too many close calls. Looking back, I still don't know how we made it through. It started with a landslide. We had planned one route, but as we made our way toward the village we needed to pass through, we realized something was wrong. The air had a heaviness to it, a smell that wasn't just dirt and rock. It was worse, rotting flesh, thick in the heat of the sun. The entire village had been wiped out. Houses crushed, the ground unstable beneath our feet. We picked our way across the ruined land, stepping carefully, trying not to think too much about what we might be stepping over. It was a slow, miserable crossing, the stench clinging to our clothes. We barely spoke when we made it to the other side. But that wasn't the worst part. We finally reached the starting point for our planned route, only to learn that an avalanche had just torn through. A group of hikers had been buried, dead. Some of the bodies hadn't even been recovered yet. It was clear that continuing on wasn't an option, so we had to change our plan. We picked a different trail and started walking. By day 4, we reached a small village, one of those places barely touched by tourism. It should have been a welcome stop, a chance to rest. But something was off. People whispered in small groups, eyes flicking toward us as we walked through. We found out why soon enough. Just a week before, a local man had been caught poisoning tourists, killing them, and selling their gear. His neighbors had finally turned him in, but who knew how many others like him were still out there? It left a bad feeling in my stomach. That feeling only got worse as the days went on. At one point, we lost the trail. The path had faded into loose rock, and we weren't sure which way to go. That's when we met him, a local man, standing a short distance away, pointing in one direction. "This way," he said. Nothing else. Just those 2 words, repeated over and over. He didn't answer questions, didn't seem concerned when we hesitated. He just kept pointing, urging us forward. We followed him. That was a mistake. We had been around 2,500 meters in elevation when we met him. By the time we realized something was wrong, we were at 5,500 meters. In one day, a climb like that isn't just difficult, it's dangerous. Altitude sickness can hit fast, and we had pushed too hard too fast. The second we understood what had happened, we turned and ran, trying to descend before it was too late. The sun was setting, and we stumbled down the mountain, lungs burning, vision swimming. By the time we reached lower ground, we were exhausted. But there was no real chance to rest. At the highest point of the trek, we made another mistake, drinking from a bad water source. It was the only option we had, and we were desperate. What followed was a combination of altitude sickness and giardia, a nightmare of nausea, dizziness, and violent sickness from both ends. We could barely keep walking, but we had no choice. And the locals? Almost all of them carried machetes, long, curved, rusted blades, always within reach. They weren't aggressive, but seeing those weapons everywhere added an extra layer of unease to everything. Then there was the village. We had taken a non-tourist route for the last 2 weeks, ending up in a place unlike anywhere else we had seen. Most of the people there had physical deformities, crooked limbs, hunched backs, twisted fingers. There was no common language, so we communicated in gestures, asking for a place to sleep. They gave us food. It smelled off, but we hadn't eaten in over 13 hours. We forced it down, knowing we needed the energy. By morning, we regretted it. Our bodies gave out. We barely made it out of our shelter before we started violently purging everything we had eaten. Over and over, our stomachs emptied until there was nothing left but pain. But we couldn't stay. We had to leave. There was no help here, no supplies that wouldn't make us sicker. We turned what should have been an 8-hour walk into 2 miserable 13-hour days, pushing forward, stopping only when absolutely necessary. Every step was a battle, every minute stretched on forever. Finally, we made it back to civilization. A guide overheard us talking about the village and told us the truth. Their food storage had been contaminated with fertilizer, and at least 20 of them had died because of it. We had barely survived. It took a full week for our bodies to recover. Even after we stopped vomiting, the weakness remained. The memories of that trip never really faded. It wasn't just a bad hike. It was something else. Something that stripped us down to nothing, pushing us past limits we didn't know we had. I still don't know how we made it through. But I do know this: I'll never go back. The Appalachian Trail had always been something I wanted to do. At 16, I had the chance to go on a 6-day, 50-mile hike through a section of it, and I thought it would be one of the best experiences of my life. It was in a way, but not for the reasons I expected. I still look back on it and wonder how I made it through. The physical exhaustion, the dehydration, the fear. I had never felt so helpless in my life. The first day was fine. Long, tiring, but manageable. The pack on my back weighed around 40 pounds, which was a lot for someone as small as I was, but I powered through. I had trained for this, and I was determined to push myself. We set up camp after the first stretch of hiking, and I remember thinking that, while it was tough, I could handle it. I had no idea what was coming. On the second day, everything changed. We had a 12-mile day ahead of us, and 3 miles in, I was hiking through a narrow section of trail with 2 other guys. The path was tight, overgrown with brush, and we had to move single file to get through. The morning air was thick with humidity, and sweat was already running down my back. My shoulders ached from the weight of my pack, but I kept moving, focusing on the rhythm of my steps. Then, out of nowhere, a sharp, stabbing pain shot through my legs. It felt like tiny needles puncturing my skin all at once. I barely had time to register what was happening before I looked down and saw them. Hundreds of small, black bodies swarming my legs. Ground hornets. Panic took over instantly. All 3 of us screamed and bolted. My pack, heavy and awkward, slammed against my back as I ran. My lungs burned. I didn't even know where I was going. I just needed to get away. My boots pounded against the dirt, but the hornets were still on me. I felt more and more stings, each one a searing jolt of pain. It felt like my skin was being set on fire. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, I finally stopped. My chest was heaving, and my entire body was shaking. I looked down. My legs were covered in angry red welts, and to my horror, some of the hornets were still stuck in my socks, their tiny bodies writhing as they continued to sting. I frantically swatted at them, killing them one by one, but the damage had already been done. My legs felt like they were on fire. My skin throbbed in waves of pain, and I could feel the swelling already starting. Then the real fear hit me. I was allergic to some kind of stinging insect. I didn't know if it was bees, wasps, or hornets, but if it was hornets, I was screwed. My throat could close up. I could go into anaphylactic shock right there on the trail, alone. I had an EpiPen, but I didn't know if I needed it yet. If I used it and didn't need it, I'd be draining myself of adrenaline I might need later. If I didn't use it and my throat started closing, I wouldn't have time to get it in me before I passed out. To make it worse, I was alone. The other 2 guys had sprinted off in different directions. I had no idea where they were. My heart was pounding too fast, my breathing was ragged, and I could feel the edges of panic creeping in. My hands started to shake, and before I knew it, I was gasping for air, my vision blurring as my chest tightened. A panic attack. I forced myself to sit. I clenched my fists and closed my eyes, focusing on slowing my breathing. 1 breath in. Hold it. 1 breath out. My heart still hammered against my ribs, but slowly, I regained control. I needed to find the rest of the group. I stood up on shaky legs and forced myself forward. Every step sent fresh jolts of pain through my legs. The swelling was getting worse. The skin around the stings felt tight, stretched, almost unnatural. My socks were damp with sweat, but I kept moving. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The pain wasn't getting better, it was getting worse. And that's when it happened again. I stepped forward, and suddenly, the air was alive with movement. A familiar, horrible buzzing sound filled my ears. Another swarm. Before I could even react, they were on me again. The first sting hit the back of my knee, then another on my thigh, then my ankle. I didn't think, I just ran. My pack felt even heavier this time, weighing me down, but I didn't stop. My legs were barely working, but I pushed forward, crashing through the brush, trying to escape. I could barely see through the tears in my eyes. The pain was unbearable. By the time I finally stopped, I collapsed onto the ground. My legs were unrecognizable. The welts had grown into swollen, angry mounds. Some of the stings had started to bleed from where I had scratched at them without thinking. The skin was stretched so tight I thought it might split open. I broke down. I had never cried like that before. It wasn't just the pain. It was the exhaustion, the fear, the sheer hopelessness of the situation. I was 16, alone in the middle of the woods, covered in venom, and my body was shutting down on me. My legs weren't working right anymore. My muscles felt weak and unsteady. Then the nausea hit. I barely had time to turn to the side before my stomach emptied itself onto the dirt. My throat burned, and my head spun. My body wasn't just in pain, it was rejecting everything. I tried to drink water, but my stomach twisted in protest, and I gagged it back up. I was getting dehydrated fast. Somehow, I kept moving. Every step felt impossible, but I knew stopping meant risking worse. I had to get back to my group. I had to make it. I don't remember much of the next few hours. Everything blurred together into a haze of pain, dehydration, and exhaustion. I must have found my way back, because at some point, I was in camp. Someone helped me. Someone got me water. I think they gave me antihistamines, but it's hard to remember. I didn't quit the trip. I don't know how, but I finished the full 6 days, all 50 miles. By the end, my legs were still swollen, but I could walk. The nausea faded after a couple of days, but the weakness lasted longer. Even after I got home, I felt the effects for weeks. Looking back, I still don't know how I made it through that hike. But I do know one thing: I will never ever go near a hornet's nest again. Hiking the Appalachian Trail and the Pacific Crest Trail had been my dream for as long as I could remember. I had spent years preparing, reading every guide, watching every documentary, and training my body to endure the months of walking, carrying weight, and surviving in the wild. I thought I knew what to expect. I thought I was ready. I wasn't. The things that scared me the most weren't the cold, the exhaustion, or even the wildlife. It was the things I never saw coming. The things that had nothing to do with nature and everything to do with people. It was sometime in Virginia, maybe Glasgow, where I set up camp near a small shelter along the trail. It wasn't an official campground, just one of those spots where hikers naturally gathered for the night. There was a fire ring, some logs to sit on, and enough space for a few tents. I had been hiking alone for most of the day, enjoying the steady rhythm of my boots on the dirt, the quiet of the forest, the way the sun filtered through the leaves. It had been uneventful, just another long day on the trail. As evening settled, I wasn't alone anymore. A few other hikers had arrived, setting up their own camps. Among them were 2 men who immediately made me uneasy. They were scruffy, unkempt in a way that didn't just say long-distance hiker, but something else, something more desperate. They reeked of alcohol, their clothes stained and torn in ways that suggested they hadn't just been on the trail too long, but had been living like this for far longer. They brought a bottle of something strong to the fire. The smell of burning would mix with the sharp bite of whatever they were drinking. I kept to myself, staying near my tent, but I could hear them talking. It started normal enough: trail stories, complaints about the terrain, jokes about how much their feet hurt. Then slowly it shifted. They started asking me questions, repeating the same one over and over. "How old are you?" I answered once, trying to keep my voice steady, trying not to show anything. But they kept asking, like they hadn't heard me, like they didn't care what I said, only that they could keep making me answer. Then the conversation turned darker. One of them started talking about setting a dog on fire. He laughed like it was the funniest thing in the world, like it was just a casual story. The other one started talking about people he knew who had been murdered. He spoke about it too easily, too comfortably, like it was something he thought about often. I stayed quiet. I wasn't alone, though. There were others at the site, including 2 guys who looked like they could handle themselves, big, strong, the kind of men who carried themselves with confidence. I learned later they were in the army. I kept my distance from the fire, but I didn't leave. I didn't want to make myself look like a target. I just sat there, watching, waiting, keeping my body calm while my mind screamed at me to get away. Eventually, the 2 men got too drunk to function. They slurred their words, stumbled over their own feet. The tension never fully left, but they were too out of it to be a threat anymore. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in my tent, my knife close to my hand, listening to every sound. By morning, they were gone. I don't know where they went. I don't want to know. But I've thought about them every time I've set up camp alone since. The PCT was different from the AT. The terrain, the climate, the sheer scale of it, everything felt bigger, more open, more exposed. I had been hiking through the mountains, pushing through high passes and rocky trails, when I saw something that didn't make sense. Huge black tendrils, curling over the ridge like fingers reaching down toward me. For a split second, my brain couldn't process it. It didn't look like anything I had ever seen before. Then I realized what it was. A dust storm. It was coming fast. I was too high up, too exposed. Running wasn't an option, not all the way to safety. But I had to move, had to get lower, had to find some kind of shelter before it hit. I ran. My pack slammed against my back with every step. My legs burned from the sudden effort. The wind was already picking up, grains of sand stinging my skin, biting into my face. I found a small flat spot and threw down my tent, my hands shaking as I forced the poles into the ground, jamming stakes deep into the dirt. I grabbed rocks, big ones, heavy ones, and placed them inside the tent, on top of the stakes, anywhere I could to weigh it down. The storm was nearly on top of me now, the wind roaring, the sky darkening with dust. I barely managed to crawl inside before it hit. The force of it was like nothing I had ever felt. The entire tent lifted, straining against the weight of me, my pack, and the rocks. The fabric rattled like it was about to tear apart. Sand blasted through the mesh, coating everything. I curled up, arms around my body, waiting for it to end. It didn't. The storm raged all night. The wind never stopped, never lessened, never gave me a break. I could hear things slamming outside, debris flying past. The air inside my tent was thick with dust, making it hard to breathe. My throat was dry, my eyes burned, but I couldn't do anything except wait. Somehow my tent survived. By morning, the world outside looked different. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, the ground reshaped by the wind. My tent was battered but intact. I stepped outside, legs shaking, trying to take in what had just happened. It was one of the most brutal nights I had ever spent in the wild. And it wouldn't be the last. Somewhere along the PCT, I got bitten by something. At first, it was just an itchy bump. Nothing to worry about. Then it got worse. The skin around it turned dark, then black. The pain went from an ache to a deep, throbbing agony. I could feel it spreading, the tissue dying, my body fighting against the venom. A brown recluse. It had to be. There was no real treatment out there. No way to stop it. I just had to let my body handle it, had to keep going. The wound oozed, the skin around it peeled away, leaving raw, exposed flesh. Every movement sent new waves of pain through my body, but I had no choice. I had to keep walking. And then came the sunburns. The kind that blister, that make every inch of skin feel like it's being peeled away. The kind that make wearing a pack unbearable, that turn every movement into torture. I don't know how I got through it all, but I did. I finished the trails. And I learned something. Nature is cruel, but it's predictable. You can prepare for storms, for heat, for cold. People are the real danger. And they're the one thing you can never fully prepare for. Hiking alone had never really bothered me before. I had done plenty of solo trips, slept in the woods more times than I could count, and had a decent understanding of what to expect when spending nights away from civilization. But this night in Sweden was different. It wasn't the remoteness of the trail, nor was it the weather or the wildlife. It was something else entirely, something I still have trouble wrapping my head around. I had been hiking for several days already, making my way through the southern part of the country. The trails were well marked, the scenery was beautiful, and the isolation was something I had grown to appreciate. But on this particular day, the weather had taken a turn. The sky was heavy with clouds, and though the rain hadn't started yet, the air carried that thick, damp feeling that warned of an incoming storm. The wind had picked up slightly, making the trees creak as they swayed. I came across one of those wooden weather shelters that were common in Sweden. A simple structure, 3 wooden walls, a slanted roof, and an open front facing the trail. There was a picnic table a few feet in front of it, with a fire pit nearby. It was the kind of place designed for hikers who needed a quick place to rest or wait out bad weather. I decided to stop for the night. It seemed like a good spot, and with the weather looking worse by the hour, it made sense to have some kind of cover. I dropped my pack, stretched my legs, and took a few minutes to check the area. The shelter was empty, and I hadn't seen another person in hours. It was quiet, just the occasional rustling of trees and the distant sounds of water lapping against the shore. I ate a quick meal, drank some water, and settled into my sleeping bag. The ground was firm but dry, and though the wind was still moving through the trees, it felt safe enough. The last thing I remember before falling asleep was staring out at the landscape, the darkening sky turning a deep shade of gray as the moon slowly rose. I woke up to the sound of footsteps on gravel. It took me a second to register where I was. My mind was still foggy with sleep, but the sound was unmistakable, someone walking along the trail. It wasn't the usual light crunch of small animals moving through the underbrush. These were deliberate steps. Slow, measured, the kind of sound that only comes from a person. I kept my breathing steady, trying not to move. My eyes were barely open, just enough to see through the opening of the shelter. The moon was nearly full, casting a soft glow over the clearing. Then I saw him, a shadow moving along the trail, coming closer. I couldn't make out his face, but he was tall, his body outlined against the moonlight. He was walking directly toward the shelter. At first, I assumed it was another hiker. Maybe someone caught in the bad weather, looking for a place to rest. That would have made sense. But as he got closer, something felt off. He wasn't carrying a pack. No gear. Just walking, slow and steady, straight toward me. He stepped right up to the shelter, just a few feet away, and then stopped. For a moment, he stood there, completely still. Then, as if just realizing I was there, he turned and walked over to the picnic table. He sat down on the bench, facing the water. That's when I noticed it. He wasn't wearing any pants. From the waist down, he was completely naked, just sitting there, watching the sea, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. I felt my pulse in my throat. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get up and leave, but I forced myself to stay still. He hadn't seen me move yet. Maybe he thought I was asleep. If I stayed quiet, maybe he would just go away. Minutes passed, maybe longer. I kept my eyes half closed, only daring to take small glances at him. He didn't move much, just sat there, staring at the water. I must have drifted off at some point, despite everything in me telling me to stay awake. The next time I woke up, it wasn't because of the man. It was because of a flashlight shining directly in my face. I bolted upright, my heart slamming against my ribs. 3 figures stood in front of the shelter. 2 women and a man, all wearing dark clothing. One of them held the flashlight, the beam blinding me. I squinted, my mind racing. Who the hell were they? They were talking to me, asking questions, but my brain was still trying to catch up. I managed to piece together that they were some kind of private security or civil patrol. Maybe locals who kept an eye on the trails. I told them who I was and what I was doing there. They listened, then nodded and walked away. I should have felt safer after that, but I didn't. I laid back down, my body tense. The flashlight had woken me up, but I didn't know what time it was. Maybe 1 a.m. The moon had shifted, casting long shadows across the clearing. That's when I heard it again. The gravel. Slow footsteps. He was back. I barely breathed, keeping my body as still as possible. My hand moved slowly toward my pack, fingers closing around my small pocket knife. My other hand found my deodorant spray. It wasn't much, but it was something. He was circling the shelter this time, not just walking up to it, moving around it. I heard the crunch of his steps on the gravel, then the softer sound of him stepping onto the grass. He was close, too close. Then silence. I held my breath, straining to hear where he had gone, but there was nothing. I don't know how long I lay there, every muscle in my body locked in place. Maybe he was still there, just out of sight, watching. The hours crawled by. I didn't sleep again. I stayed curled in my sleeping bag, my grip tight around my knife. The only comfort I had was knowing that the sun would rise soon. By 3:30 a.m., the first faint glow appeared on the horizon. The second I saw it, I moved. I packed my gear in record time, my hands shaking. I didn't even stop to eat. As soon as everything was secured, I threw my pack over my shoulder and started walking. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I just kept going, putting as much distance between myself and that shelter as I could. Even now, I don't know what his intentions were. Maybe he was just some strange man who liked wandering the woods half-naked. Or maybe it was something worse. I'll never know. But I do know one thing. I won't be sleeping in a weather shelter alone ever again. The desert in Southern California is a place of extremes. High, arid mountains and stretches of land that feel like they belong to a time before humans ever set foot here. I'd been itching for a solo hike, a way to get away from everything and just spend some time in the wild. February was the perfect month. Cold nights that reminded me of the crispness of winter, but temperate days, not too hot and not too cold. It felt like a good time to disappear for a while. I drove for hours to reach the starting point. The trailhead was deep in the desert, about 30 miles in, if you were aiming for the main campgrounds. The roads were winding, rocky, and the scenery around me seemed to stretch on forever. By the time I finally reached the campgrounds, the sun was dipping low on the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the land. I set up camp by a mountain stream that trickled through the high desert floor, its path winding between rocks and patches of sparse vegetation. The stream was cold, colder than I expected, but the water, flowing freely from the snowmelt higher up the mountain, was clear and pristine. I could hear the soft sound of it moving over the rocks, like a gentle lullaby. It had been a long day of hiking, so I set about melting some water for cooking and hydration. The fire crackled as the night descended, turning the landscape around me into shadows, but I didn't mind. The night air was chilly, but my gear was good, and the sound of the stream kept me company. As I sat by the fire, I thought about the grime that had built up from the hike. My skin was caked in dirt, and I wanted to rinse off. The water in the stream was inviting, even though it was freezing. I figured it would be a quick, refreshing dip. I grabbed my towel and stripped down, wading into the stream. The shock of the cold water hit immediately, my body tensing up as I sank into the shallow section. The water came up to my waist, a little higher in the middle of the stream. I shivered uncontrollably at first, but the sensation started to numb the edges of my body, and I pushed forward into the current, splashing around a bit to clean off. But then something moved in the water. I felt it before I saw it. A strange shift in the current, the water swirling around something heavy. At first, I thought it might have been a rock or a piece of debris carried downstream. But when I focused my gaze, I saw the shape clearly, a translucent white, undulating mass about 3 to 4 feet long, moving slowly upstream. My stomach dropped. I've hiked in a lot of places, but nothing prepared me for what I was seeing. It didn't look like any fish I'd ever encountered. It was too big, too long. And it wasn't behaving like any fish either. It wasn't darting around. It wasn't swimming in a predictable pattern. It was moving slowly, steadily, almost as though it was pushing against the current. I froze. Whatever it was, it didn't seem to notice me at first. Or at least, it didn't seem to care. But that didn't make it any less unsettling. The water around it shifted with each movement, the shape undulating, as though it were alive, and whatever it was too big to be anything familiar. I had seen plenty of wildlife in my time, but nothing like this. Instinct kicked in. I turned to leave the water, my feet fumbling on the slippery rocks beneath me. But the cold had numbed my legs, and as I tried to climb out of the stream, my shins and knees collided with the jagged rocks lining the bank. The pain was sharp and sudden, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to get out, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I finally pulled myself up onto the bank, panting. The water splashed around my ankles as I stumbled back, my heart still racing. I didn't stop to look back. I just moved, stumbling over the uneven ground, my mind barely keeping up with my body. When I reached the safety of the campsite, I sat down, my heart still hammering in my chest. I didn't dare look back toward the water, not even as I grabbed my gear. My knees were scraped up, blood mixing with the dirt, but it didn't matter. All I could think about was what I had just seen. I didn't say anything to anyone else on the trail when I returned to the campgrounds later that evening. They wouldn't have believed me. They never do when you're alone out here. It's always easy to dismiss things when you're not the one who saw them. They'd probably just tell me I was seeing things, or that the cold water had messed with my head. But I knew what I saw, and I wasn't about to go back near that stream to figure out what it was. The night went on, cold and quiet. I stayed by the fire as much as I could, barely able to keep my eyes open, my thoughts spinning in circles. I wasn't tired, not exactly. But I was uneasy, and no matter how much I told myself it was all in my head, that thing in the stream kept replaying itself. By morning, the cold had seeped deep into my bones. The sky was pale blue, and the sun was just beginning to rise over the mountains. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, barely touching the water or the stream again. I heard the sounds of the desert around me, the calls of birds, the rustling of the wind, and the distant rumble of the mountains. But there was no sound coming from the stream. The current was still, unnervingly still, and the water looked almost placid, as though it were hiding something beneath its surface. I didn't stay long. I knew I wouldn't be camping by that stream again. I left the campgrounds with as much speed as I could muster, my feet eager to put distance between myself and the water. I don't know what that thing was in the stream. It wasn't a snake. It wasn't a fish. And it definitely wasn't anything I could identify as native to the area. I didn't want to think about it too much, but I couldn't help myself. Something about it wasn't right, and I felt a chill every time I thought about it. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was fully up, and the desert was starting to warm up, but I wasn't taking any chances. I kept my eyes peeled, scanning the rocks and the brush around me. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just some strange creature that I couldn't identify. But that thing in the stream, that's something I'll never forget. The memory still lingers. And every time I go hiking in that area, even if I'm miles away from that stream, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching from the water just below the surface, waiting. The lake was still. We had paddled for most of the day, making our way through a long, narrow stretch of water that cut between thick, untouched forest. The canoe was heavy with gear, packs, food, tent, but we had made good time, choosing a campsite about halfway down the lake, a small clearing just off the shore. It was perfect. A flat patch of ground, enough space for the tent, and a little opening between the trees that gave us a clear view of the water. By the time the sun dipped below the tree line, the fire was going, and the quiet settled in. The kind of silence you only find deep in the woods, where the world shrinks down to just you, the trees, and the dark water stretching out in front of you. It always takes a little while to adjust to it, to let go of the noise of daily life, and just listen. The crackling of the fire, the lapping of the water against the shore, the occasional rustling in the trees. You remind yourself it's just the wind, or a small animal, and not something watching from the shadows. We cooked, ate, cleaned up, and let the fire burn down to embers before calling it a night. My wife climbed into the tent first, and I stayed up a little longer, enjoying the quiet, staring out over the lake. The moon was up, but not full, just a dim glow behind a thin layer of clouds. After a while, I decided to wash up before turning in. I walked down to the edge of the lake, crouching at the waterline, and splashed the cold water onto my face. It shocked me awake for a moment, that sharp bite of mountain-fed water, but it felt good, refreshing. Then I looked up. 2 small lights were across the lake. Headlamps. 50 meters wasn't far, not even a full paddle's length in the canoe, but it was dark enough that I could only make out those 2 little pinpricks of light moving slowly through the trees. The fact that anyone else was out here surprised me. We had seen no signs of other campers all day. No canoes, no distant campfire smoke. And yet there they were. They were moving, but not fast. Hesitant, almost uncertain. I watched for a while, wondering what they were doing. They would stop for long moments, then the lights would bob and shift, then stop again. It didn't seem like they were setting up camp, more like they were looking for something. Then suddenly the lights died. Just gone. No dimming, no flickering, just an abrupt and total blackness. I waited. Sometimes people turn their lamps off to save battery. Maybe they were climbing into their tent for the night. Maybe they had just reached their site and were getting settled. Then I heard it. A deep, heavy snorting. Loud. Too loud to be the wind. Too forceful to be some small animal. Something big was over there. The sound came again. A deep exhale through wide nostrils, followed by the sharp crunch of something moving through the brush. A moose. Or worse. My stomach tightened. I knew that moose could be unpredictable, especially during the rut, and bears. Well, bears were always a concern in the backcountry. The sound had come from the same area where I had just seen the lights. They weren't moving anymore. I swallowed, then called out across the water. "Hey, are you all right?" Silence. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined the lights. Maybe I had let the quiet get to me, let my mind turn a normal forest sound into something worse. Then, from across the lake, movement. A voice, faint but real, calling back. They had taken the wrong trail. I listened, piecing the story together from the broken, distant words drifting across the water. They had started at the wrong parking lot, had hiked for hours in the dark, and when they finally reached the lake, they had gone down the wrong side. And now they were trapped. No lights, no way to set up camp, and something big moving nearby. I turned and looked at our canoe, pulled up onto the shore. The thought of getting back on the water in the dark didn't thrill me. Lakes at night are different. Depthless, black, full of nothing and everything at the same time. But I knew what they were facing. It could take them hours to hike to the next campsite, if they even knew where it was. And without headlamps, stumbling through the trees in the pitch black with a moose or a bear nearby. That wasn't an option. I grabbed my paddle. The lake was so calm it barely made a sound as I slid the canoe into the water. My breath sounded too loud in the stillness as I stepped in and pushed off. The moment I left the shore, I felt it, that familiar unease of floating over deep water in total darkness. The blackness below me felt bottomless, like anything could be down there. I gripped my paddle and moved fast, my eyes locked on the opposite shore. The snorting sound came again, closer now. A large shape moved through the brush, but I couldn't see what it was. I could only hear it. Heavy steps, snapping twigs. When I reached the shore, 2 figures were waiting. They looked exhausted. I handed them my spare flashlight and steadied the canoe as they climbed in. They moved carefully, but the canoe still rocked under the shifting weight. I didn't want to think about what would happen if we tipped. I pushed off, and we drifted back into the center of the lake. From the darkness behind us, another loud exhale. Whatever it was, it had been close. No one spoke as we crossed the water. The only sound was the quiet dip of my paddle and the occasional lapping of water against the hull. The moment we reached the shore, they scrambled out, dragging their packs with them. They were relieved, grateful. I stayed up while they set up their tent, my flashlight beam cutting through the trees as they worked. By the time they were settled, I felt the exhaustion settle into my bones. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me heavy, slow. I climbed back into my own tent, pulling my sleeping bag tight around me. The lake was silent again. The woods were as they had been before. But I didn't sleep for a long time. All I could think about was how close they had been to spending the night lost in the dark, with something big breathing just outside the trees. I had been hiking for over 2 hours, and I was soaked in sweat. The August sun pressed down on me, and the air felt thick, unmoving. The heat clung to my skin, made worse by the long pants I had stubbornly worn. I knew better, knew it would be miserable, knew I'd overheat, but I had read too many warnings about ticks in the tall grass. And the grass was everywhere. Golden waves of it, stretching up past my knees on either side of the faint, barely there trail. It swayed gently in the occasional breeze that never seemed to reach me. The trail was an old herding path, rough and unmarked, winding through a remote stretch of wilderness I had hiked a few times before. Not an official route, not even a maintained one, just a barely visible track that wove through dense spruce forest and followed the course of a slow-moving stream. It was beautiful, untouched, the kind of place you could walk for miles without seeing another person. That was part of the reason I had chosen it. I had no friends in the area, and I liked it that way. I had moved out here fresh out of college, craving space, quiet. Out here, no one knew me. No one expected anything from me. It was just me in the woods. But right now, I was roasting alive. The trail dipped down toward the stream, and I caught glimpses of it through the trees, dark, glassy water edged with green, slow-moving and inviting. I could hear it, too, the quiet trickle of water rolling over smooth stones, the occasional splash of something moving beneath the surface. It looked incredible. I kept walking, pushing farther into no man's land, until I reached a bend in the river. It was perfect. The trees opened up here, revealing a shallow bank of smooth, water-worn rocks. The grass thinned out, giving way to softer earth. The river itself widened, deepened. It was shaded, cool. I stood there for a while, breathing hard, sweat dripping down my back, and finally gave in. I wasn't worried about anyone stumbling upon me. No one hiked this far out. No one knew about this trail. So I stripped, peeled off my shirt, my pants, everything, and stepped into the water. The shock was immediate. The river was mountain-fed, which meant the water was ice-cold, even in the peak of summer. It hit me like a slap, a sudden gasp escaping my throat as I pushed deeper. But the relief was instant. The heat vanished, replaced by the sharp, almost painful chill of the water swallowing me whole. I let it happen, let it pull the heat from my skin, and for the first time all day, I felt good. I stood there for a while, chest deep, letting my body adjust, listening to the quiet. The forest around me was still, the occasional bird call breaking the silence. Somewhere upstream, a branch snapped, but I ignored it. Probably just a deer. Then I got curious. I had never gone past this bend in the river. The trail veered away from the water shortly after this point, cutting through thicker forest. But I had always wondered what was around the corner, what lay just out of sight. And right now, I was already in the water. I was already wet. So I waded forward. The river deepened slightly as I moved, reaching up to my collarbones. The rocks under my feet were slick, forcing me to take slow, careful steps. I barely made a sound. I reached the bend and peered around it. More spruce trees. More water. A large, smooth boulder resting half-submerged near the shore. And next to it, a bull moose. He was massive, easily over 1,000 pounds, with long, knotted legs and a thick, heavy body. His antlers rose like bare tree branches above his head, still covered in the soft, velvety fuzz of summer growth. His coat was dark brown, nearly black, slick with water. He was drinking. His huge head dipped down, his broad snout breaking the surface, sending tiny ripples through the otherwise motionless water. And he hadn't seen me. I froze. I was no more than 50 feet from him, completely naked, standing in chest-deep water with nowhere to go. Moose are unpredictable. People always worry about bears, but moose kill more people each year. They're huge, fast, and aggressive when they want to be. And right now, I was too close. Way too close. Panic surged through me. My breath caught in my throat. My body tensed, ready to move, but I knew I couldn't. Not yet. Not fast. I had to get out of here. Slowly, I turned in the water. I moved as carefully as I could, each step a calculated shift, trying not to create ripples, trying not to make a sound. I didn't breathe, didn't blink. Every time I exhaled, the words slipped out under my breath. I don't want to die. It became a rhythm, a quiet chant, a desperate, whispered plea. The water felt endless, the distance to shore stretching farther than it had been before. I fought the urge to bolt. I fought the instinct screaming at me to move faster. I kept going, and then, a splash. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if it was him. I reached the shallows, my feet hitting solid ground, and I ran. I ran straight out of the water, through the trees, through the thick underbrush, completely naked, feet slipping over moss and dirt. Branches clawed at my skin, burrs clung to my legs. My heart slammed against my ribs, but I didn't stop. I ran until I couldn't hear the water anymore, until my lungs burned and my legs ached. I stopped just long enough to pull on my underwear and my shoes. Screw the rest, I needed to move. I kept going, didn't slow down, didn't look back. The woods felt different now. The quiet that had once been peaceful was now suffocating, like the trees were holding their breath, waiting. Every snapped twig, every rustling leaf sent another jolt of panic through me. I just needed to get back to my car. I pushed forward, lungs aching, every muscle screaming at me to stop. Finally, I saw it. The car was still there, parked where I had left it. I reached it, yanked the door open, and collapsed into the driver's seat. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely get the keys in the ignition. I sat there for a long time, heart racing, staring at the empty road ahead. The silence of the woods pressed against the windows, thick and heavy. Eventually, the shaking stopped. Eventually, my breathing slowed. And eventually, I started to laugh. It was shaky, breathless. More out of relief than anything. I had just gone skinny, dipping with a bull moose in the middle of the wilderness. And somehow, I had made it out.